Things in the world seem pretty bad right now, and so that leads us to ask the question, are we on the brink of war? In today's International Affairs News Roundup, we're going to be talking about Iran's ability to procure and develop nuclear weapons, as well as their activities throughout the Middle East, as well as how the US has been roped into these different conflicts. Before we talk about North Korea and a report from two analysts discussing North Korea's willingness to go to war. Those stories and more in today's video. First off, let's talk about Iran. Iran might be closer to developing nuclear weapons than we think. A report by David Albright, who is a prominent analyst on nuclear weapons and expert in the field, stated that Iran might be able to produce one or several nuclear weapons that are low to medium yield within a week. He notes that Iran's capabilities have grown significantly since 2003, and he notes that Iran's enrichment levels have risen to the point that they are becoming concerning, far exceeding civilian needs and reaching the point that they could be weaponized quickly. That said, knowing that Iran doesn't already have nuclear weapons is itself a challenge. Iran has a large series of underground tunnels and facilities that could hinder the international ability to register that Iran has nuclear weapons. And of course, this network is designed to protect these facilities from any kinds of airstrikes or surveillance. These facilities can host very important parts of the nuclear development life cycle, including enrichment facilities, manufacturing facilities, and storage facilities. The secrecy and the protection of these tunnels make it incredibly difficult for international monitoring groups like the IAEA from being able to detect and register if nuclear weapons are being created in these facilities. For instance, obviously satellite and aerial intelligence is going to have its limits. Really, you're not going to be able to understand what's going on underground because you can't see it. I say all of this in the context that the Middle East is kind of exploding right now, and Iran finds themselves right in the middle of the whole conflict. And Iran gaining nuclear weapons is really not good for anybody. Even if Iran chooses not to use nuclear weapons in a conflict, which we should hope, their mere deterrence value can be a significant factor in the determination of any kind of strike packages or responses to what terrorist groups that are affiliated with Iran are doing. And even then, just adding nuclear weapons in general into a massive conflict with multiple different sides and multiple actors, many of which don't even adhere to nation state or international frameworks, that's really a bad idea. Having said all of that, it may not be a bad idea if you are a country that is in the conflict and you're worried that you're going to lose that conflict, and so you need some insurance. And that really incentivizes Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Now, speaking of risks and the conflict escalating, we need to take a look at the Israeli-Lebanese border because that's really where things are starting to heat up a little bit more. Israel has made efforts to reach a diplomatic settlement regarding its low-grade conflict with Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon. That said, Israel has reportedly planned to escalate military action against Hezbollah if they do not meet the requirements the IDF has laid out for them. Specifically, Israel wants Hezbollah to move a certain distance away from the border with Israel. And of course, they want the rocket attacks and the strikes on IDF targets to end. Israel has for a while kept a diplomatic channel open with Hezbollah just to keep the conflict from escalating too far. However, they've also been very clear with their intention to escalate with Hezbollah if needed. And while Israel wants Hezbollah to withdraw from the border, Hezbollah actually has an incentive to stay on the border because it draws Israeli forces away from Gaza and onto the border with Lebanon, and that really prevents Israel from going full force into Gaza. It also threatens Israel with the potential of a new front in a war and really gives Israel some sort of strategic pause in completely handling the Hamas situation. If you consider the risk of Hezbollah, which is absolutely massive and really should be considered some sort of a peer with the IDF, then also consider the threat of other groups throughout Syria and Iraq that are affiliated with the Axis of Resistance. And if you don't know what that is, I talked about it in a breakdown on Hezbollah, which you can check out in this video. But just a quick broad brush overview, it's basically a network of terrorist groups that are all aligned with Iran and receive different kinds of funding and support and direction from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. It's been a bit of a theme in the videos that we've been talking about lately because of this conflict going on in the Middle East. The IRGC is kind of networked through all of these conflicts. These groups in Iraq and Syria have been very routine in targeting U.S. targets throughout the Middle East, with over 80 U.S. personnel receiving injuries since the war in Gaza began. Just last week, one Iraqi group launched a ballistic missile attack on the Al-Assad airbase, which is a significant escalation because, of course, they're ballistic missiles. They pack a way bigger punch than the normal kind of rocket attacks we've seen in the past. And while this led to a number of U.S. personnel getting traumatic brain injuries, luckily no one was killed. And of course, all this includes the Houthis in Yemen, who, if you've been watching our previous videos, then you know that they've been very active. All of this has forced the United States to walk a tightrope. While on one hand, the United States does not want to be the sole reason why things in the Middle East escalate, on the other hand, they cannot let the status quo continue, because obviously what's going on right now is not great for anybody. While the US has attempted to handle things diplomatically, there hasn't necessarily been a strong response to the different kinds of attacks on US forces throughout the Middle East. And that has left many wondering if there will be a sort of strong attack on groups like, say, the Houthis or the different resistance groups in Iraq. And this has led to an argument inside the United States that the US really needs to be a bit more forceful. For instance, let's talk about Yemen. The US has launched continuous airstrikes on the Houthis in response to their attacks on commercial shipping and US flagships. The problem is the Houthis haven't exactly stopped. They may have slowed down for at least this past week, but they haven't stopped. And I think that this requires us as Americans to have a gut check about what's really going on. And not only us as Americans, and we're going to talk about what the rest of the world really needs to have a gut check on here in a minute as well, but let's just talk about Americans for a second. The Houthis and the other groups throughout the Middle East consider what's going on to be a war, and you can absolutely tell just looking at it, yep, that is a war. That's to say that they're putting their chips down, and whether they get hit with airstrikes or cruise missiles, it doesn't matter. They're still going to keep on their attacks until either they win or they're defeated. Moreover, there's a growing perception around the world, but especially in the Middle East, that American power is waning. And this can be viewed more globally as the reasoning behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the reasoning for China's increasing bluster around Taiwan. But we can also see it here with Iran and their willingness to get aggressive throughout the region. Simply put, people don't think that America has that dog anymore. And they're not afraid of the bark or the bite because they know that really nothing's going to hurt them. This may further be amplified by a recent foreign policy report that President Biden is considering withdrawing American forces from Iraq and Syria, which, if you remember, those forces were put there originally to combat ISIS. However, since then, they've become targets from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps as well as different axis of resistance groups. Withdrawing the US from the Middle East really creates a vacuum, and whoever fills that vacuum is going to determine the course of Middle East policy and politics for the next 10 years. We've seen a group like ISIS make the news again with their recent attack on Iran, and of course they could always refill the vacuum that they lost. However, we could also see Iran fill that vacuum, and we have to ask the question, is a Middle East led and controlled by Iran really a good thing for anybody? But you also have to wonder who else is willing to step in and fill that void. And now you're starting to see how complicated all of this gets and how there's really no good answer. However, whatever happens, it's going to have significant impacts on the rest of the globe. And if any decision is made, its negative effects will be amplified, especially in US politics, and laid at the feet of whichever president decides to make a decision. And really, this conversation on declining American power and the reactions around the world to it, it really requires its own video. So if you want to hear a longer discussion about this, let me know in the comments and I can put something together and we can talk a bit more in depth about that. However, I want to take a second to talk a bit more about how Iran has tried to exploit this perception of declining American power. Commanders from Iran's IRGC and commanders from Hezbollah have actually been on the ground in Yemen directing Houthi attacks and providing intelligence to the Houthis on when to attack commercial ships and how. Iran has escalated its support for the Houthis, providing missiles, drones, and other kinds of support. And not all of this is a huge surprise. I mean, it's not like the Houthis are particularly wealthy or technologically capable. They had to receive the capabilities to target commercial ships from somewhere. They didn't domestically or organically create their own anti-ship cruise missiles. And I'd be shocked if the Houthis created their own doctrine on how to target commercial ships. This support has to come from somewhere, and according to US officials and others, it appears to be coming from Iran, which, no kidding. But what's more gutsy to me about this report is that the planning for these attacks is actually coming from the IRGC themselves. While the Houthis are the triggermen, you can think of Iran and Hezbollah as really the planners and the brains behind the whole operation. Sure, the Houthis may try to do something like this on their own, but they're not going to be nearly as successful as they have been in disrupting commercial shipping and causing such a crisis if it wasn't for Iran and Hezbollah and their expertise. This gives Iran and Hezbollah the ability to target US ships without being directly impacted. For instance, you see the United States responding to these strikes by targeting the Houthis, and they are not striking Hezbollah or Iran directly. So really, it's a pretty good gig for Iran if you think about it. I mean, they're getting a punch in at the United States without really getting punched back. And without any direct action on Iran or Hezbollah, we're really not likely to see any kind of significant change in the status quo, at least until the Houthis have their own capabilities to target the ships completely degraded, meaning that they no longer have the capability or the missiles to launch these attacks. And this again takes us back to territory that's difficult for us us Americans. After over 20 years of conflict in the Middle East, do we really have it in us to do it all over again? And if we do go to war, then that poses challenges for the entire rest of the world. There's already conflict in Ukraine, and there could be a conflict in Korea and China. And there could be another conflict in Korea and Taiwan. And that's without even discussing the prospect of Iran generating or already having its own nuclear weapons. However, if the United States doesn't do something strong now to deter these attacks, then that may only reinforce that perception that we've already talked about of American power declining. And that sends a message to countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, and other Middle Eastern countries that we've previously been friendly to and that are not Iranian friendly but may seek some sort of agreement with Iran to ensure their own security. However, let's be real. It's not like there's only two options here. It's not like we go to war or we don't. Saudi Arabia and Israel and these other countries also bear responsibility and agency for their own security in the region. But we're not only talking about their security, we're talking about the security of very important economic corridors that go through like the Red Sea. With these corridors at risk, global trade is impacted, and that does have a very direct impact on the United States. However, with all of that being said, I want to hear your thoughts on this because this is an incredibly complicated matter, so let me know in the comments below. Now, we've just talked about the prospect of a war in the Middle East and the risks there and all that's going on with that whole situation, and it's a complete mess. However, lucky for us, it gets even worse. So we're going to talk about the prevailing risk of war in North Korea and an article published by two reputable analysts that North Korea has already determined that it's going to go to war. The article from 38 North discusses the possibility of North Korea already making the determination to go to war with South Korea. The authors, Robert Carlin and Siegfried Hecker, argue that a fundamental misunderstanding of North Korean history has actually led to tensions increasing to the point that North Korea has just decided it's done and it's going to go to war. They emphasize that North Korea's original goal of normalizing relations with the US and South Korea has actually been abandoned. And they touch on how failed international summits with Kim Jong-un and other world leaders has really led Kim Jong-un to feeling ostracized and reaching closer relations with Russia and China, and now is deciding that there's really just no other option than to forcefully reunify with South Korea. Following all of this, North Korea has followed up on its vow to demolish the Unification Monument, which was built by Kim Jong-il and was built really to signify normalization and peace on the Korean Peninsula and an ultimate reunification between North and South Korea. However, with that being demolished, Kim Jong-un has re-emphasized that South Korea is North Korea's principal enemy. Now, there is a lot to digest here, not just with the report on the Unification Monument being demolished, but also with the report by 38 North. Because really, I think we can all agree that the implications here are pretty startling. First off, let's just lay a basic understanding on what war in Korea would look like. It would be completely apocalyptic. Consider that South Korea is roughly the size of Oregon, and really the whole Korean peninsula is roughly the size of Utah. However, the whole Korean peninsula is incredibly mountainous and rugged. South Korea alone has around 52 million citizens, with North Korea having 25 citizens. And around 25 million of South Korea's 52 million citizens live in and around the Seoul area, which is within 25 to 30 miles of the DMZ, well within artillery range. Now, with the geography and the population established, remember that they're surrounded on three sides by water and on one side by China. And between South Korea and China, North Korea has one of the world's largest standing militaries with one of the world's largest artillery corps, and also has nuclear and chemical and biological weapons. That said, we've also got to point out the question on North Korean force quality. However, I need to remind everybody that if it shoots, it's good enough. Further, North Korea has a history of digging tunnels under South Korea, with incidents in the 1960s where North Korea infiltrated special forces all throughout South Korea, including a standoff and a firefight around the Blue Palace. And today, North Korea is believed to have a special forces force roughly 200,000 strong. Now, consider of course, the force quality here. Their special forces really should be considered more comparable to a U.S. Marine than, like, say, a U.S. Green Beret. However, that's still pretty deadly. Having said all that, South Korea is no slouch. With around 600,000 active duty soldiers and around 3 million in the reserves, remember that South Korea also has compulsory military service, so really everybody can become a soldier if needed. They're also also incredibly well equipped, with a defense industrial base that's so strong that Poland decided they wanted some, and they also have powerful friends. They're backed by Japan and the United States, which I think we can all agree that they're no slouches either. Now, speaking of friends, North Korea has their own friends, and that's Russia and China. However, there's no telling really what Russia or China's involvement would be in a new war in Korea. I say all of this to say that a war in an incredibly small, incredibly rugged, and an incredibly heavily and densely populated part of the world would be an abject disaster for everybody. For instance, let's say just for South Korea alone, with their 50 million people, where do they go in the case of war? From the jump, you have around 25 million people that would be immediately trying to evacuate Seoul, heading south, and they are surrounded by water on 3 sides and an active conflict on the other side. That's just excellent. For North Korea, they're completely outgunned on a technological level. While they have a lot of artillery and they can make things incredibly uncomfortable within the first 48 to 72 hours, they have no real ability to contest the airspace, and that means something. So now that we've already articulated that a war in Korea would be terrible for everybody, let's get back to the article. It doesn't take a genius to realize that a war in Korea would mean the absolute end of the Kim regime, and that's something that this article acknowledges. However, while the last Korean War ended in a stalemate, there are some differences. The only form of parity between North Korea and the United States is nuclear weapons. Last time, North Korea actually had military superiority over the South Koreans, and it wasn't until the US had to land a pretty sizable fighting force that any kind of change in the fighting situation happened. And then remember that China got involved, and it's unclear today what China's involvement would be, especially considering that they have their own issue with Taiwan to deal with, as well as their own economic challenges. Now let's play a scenario out here. In my mind, the worst case scenario would be that China attempts to take Taiwan while North Korea attempts a war in South Korea. And because nothing happens in a vacuum, let's assume that they decide to do this whenever the United States is currently engaged in a war in the Middle East that involves a significant amount of the US military. I'll let you decide who they're fighting in the Middle East against. Now, why they would do this is actually stated in the article, and we've already talked about this as well, and that goes back to the perception that American power is regressing. They believe, as Iran believes, that the US is a declining power and it cannot engage in multiple crises or wars at once. And this takes me back to an early question: is the American public willing to prove them wrong? Now let's consider this scenario for a moment. Remember that the South Korean Air Force vastly outmatches the North Korean Air Force. And as we've seen in previous wars, whoever dominates the skies dictates the terms on the ground. And while the war would start off extremely rocky and extremely deadly and dangerous, once South Korea is able to assume dominance of the sky, they could start targeting North Korean command and control nodes as well as artillery assets. And that's without the assistance of the United States, who would at the very least probably play a role in lending air support and intelligence as a minimum. On the ground, things would be absolutely nasty, with tens of millions of people immediately displaced and not really having anywhere to go geographically. All while North Korean troops infiltrate across the DMZ and target things like electric facilities, government facilities, military targets, and more. It would start off extremely chaotic and terrible. However, remember, once the airspace is controlled, then the North Korean artillery can be suppressed, and then South Korea can really start cleaning up the situation on the ground. And part of that cleanup would likely include the retaliation and destruction of the Kim Jong-un regime. And this scenario, of course, is without the use of nukes. Say North Korea does use nukes, and that really means the very quick, very specific end of Pyongyang and Kim Jong-un. Now, why would I bother playing that scenario out? Because I believe that the primary goal of autocrats is to preserve their hold on power. And a huge part of that is simply surviving. You know what's not good for survival? War with technologically superior opponents. This article from 38 North assumes that just because North Korea couldn't normalize relations with the United States and South Korea, that its only other option is war with South Korea. There are more options than just that. Truly, in a war, the US doesn't really have to do much. South Korea is very much a heavy hitter here and really needs more respect than what it's really received in American media. And besides that, North Korea has plenty more options than just war. For instance, we've seen North Korea seek closer ties with China and Russia. Kim Jong-un has been receiving the respect he's been after. It's just not with the United States or South Korea. And they could just, hang out and live like they have been. Literally nobody wants war in North Korea, not even the North Koreans. As North Korea gets closer with Russia and China, they get more aid that they could use, and really they can just continue to go on as they have been, making their continuous bellicose threats against South Korea and the United States, and that's really all. The destruction of the unification memorial is, in my opinion, just reinforcing that message to the internal North Korean audience, that their enemy is South Korea and the United States, and that really nothing has changed, but they're also not going to go to war. And while things look scary from the outside and in the news, it's because it's supposed to. It's literally designed that way. That really helps Kim Jong-un appear strong to his internal audience. It makes it seem like he's really resisting and scaring off the imperialist West. Anyway, that's where I am on this report, and I want to hear your thoughts because, again, this is another kind of complex report that really bears more discussion. Finally, I want to talk about a very no crap story, and this was really something that I was going to talk about last week, but we ran out of time, so we're going to talk about it now. Recently, Dutch General Rob Bauer, the chief of NATO's military committee, has emphasized the need for a wartime transformation of NATO. Bauer stressed the importance of preparing for an area where military to non-military fighting happens, where unpredictability is the norm, and where we really need to be prepared for every eventuality, including a war. And this isn't just a transformation that he's calling for of military capabilities, he's also calling for a transformation of both the public and the private sectors to be resilient in case of war and to be prepared to go to war if needed. We've talked about how Ukraine is having ammunition shortage issues and how Europe was originally supposed to donate 1 million rounds to Ukraine. However, they're going to miss that mark. That's actually highlighted a significant issue in the European defense industrial base and within the United States. That yes, war consumes a lot of material and you need an industry that's prepared to meet that demand. Now I say no crap to this story because, well, yeah, no crap. Ukraine's been at war for over 2 years now. They're about to enter their third year. And with the conflict in the Middle East and rising tensions in Taiwan, yeah, we're seeing that things are not really getting better and that we need to be prepared to go to war if needed. And that might sound kind of weird coming from an American whenever America spends over $1 trillion on its military. But the main cause for concern right now is the defense industrial base. And this is all across NATO. This is not just an American problem. This is very much also a European problem where many European countries really can't keep up with the demand of a conflict. Consider how much more challenging this would get in a conflict if the US or NATO was cut off from its valuable sources of supply and resources, and we really had to make do with what we had. How would we sustain the warfighting effort? How is our supply chain resilient? Is it even resilient? Even beyond that, you can't replace Jimmys and Joes in wartime, and while we've seen drones and other kinds of weapon systems really make the battlefield way more advanced, we've also seen no replacement for the soldier and their rifle. And we see a huge recruitment and retention problem amongst militaries worldwide. The private sector is simply too good. They pay more, they have better work-life balance, they have better benefits, but at the same time, they do not do much good in wartime. At least when we're talking about, fighting and winning the war. The UK is realizing this for themselves. British General Sir Patrick Sanders is actually calling for the UK to start being prepared to move into war footing and has called for British citizens to be prepared to enter military service in case of war. Now, I say all of this noting that NATO is not really in a super bad situation right now. It's just not the best. It's not as resilient as it probably should be in case of war, and there are some improvements to be made. However, I want to say that it is encouraging that we're getting this messaging out of NATO right now. It's better we hear this now before war starts than later whenever we're in the middle of a war and there's not much course correction we can actually do. Getting the defense industrial machine rolling is actually a very slow process, so getting that moving now is probably better now than later. Anyway, those are all of our cheerful news stories for this week, so if you feel good, then leave a like. If you don't, then leave a like, why not? Of course, I'm able to remain cheerful because I got Jesus, but also the Chiefs are going to probably go to another Super Bowl, fingers crossed, knock on wood. And if they don't, I really don't mind Lamar Jackson going himself. So like this video if you found it helpful or informative. Comment your thoughts on any of these stories below because there is a lot here and I want to hear your thoughts because it's a lot. And I will see you all next time.